as you could be, and appreciate you spending the time to be with us here tonight. So I'm really excited. We have a great topic and some amazing panelists on tap tonight to share experiences, expertise, and insights around the topic of emotional intelligence. So we know from research and from personal experience, many of us, that EQ is really the it factor that can make the difference between performing and truly thriving in your workplace. So tonight is dedicated to the idea that emotional intelligence is something that we can all improve. So how do we do that? What are some tips and tricks? What is the body of research around emotional intelligence? And what are some of the real world practical applications of people who are living and breathing this on a daily basis? So like I mentioned, we have some great panelists who are here to share their expertise and insights with us. A little bit of a preview of how this evening will work. One of our panelists, Pam Watson-Corbell, will be doing a brief overview of emotional intelligence, EQ. So we're all sort of on the same footing in terms of understanding the basic concepts related to EQ. So I'll turn it over to her after I introduce some of the other panelists to give us a brief overview of the topic and concept, and then we'll dive into some panelist questions that we have prepared. As Brian mentioned, we do have the chat feature that is open and available for all of our participants. So if there's a burning question and you'd like to chat that in, we'll do our best, depending on how much time we have in our limited time of an hour together, to see if there's some questions that we plan to ask or that might draw from that chat as well. So feel free to engage in the way that is meaningful for you. Like Brian mentioned, you're welcome to turn on your camera. You're welcome to chat. You're welcome to just sit back, relax, and soak it all in. We really hope that this is an informative and engaging evening for everybody, and invite you to engage in the way that's going to derive the most value for you. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to move into introducing our panelists so you know who will be on tap for the panel discussion portion of our town hall this evening. And then I will turn it over to Pam for our brief overview. So first I'd like to introduce, and Bailey, if you can sort of give a wave. I know on Zoom it can be difficult to see people in the Hollywood Square version, but Bailey Mayo is one of our graduate students here at University College, and has offered to be here tonight to share with us a little bit of her perspective, both as a student, but then also in her professional capacity. So she is finishing her master's degree in organizational leadership with concentrations in strategic innovation and change and organizational development. She has worked with EQ in multiple aspects during her career as an executive assistant for the Boston Consulting Group, and in her role serving on a nonprofit board of directors. So welcome, Bailey. We're excited to have you and look forward to your insights and perspectives tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce Maria. So Maria, if you want to do a quick wave, we'll see if we can, if you toggle screens there. So Maria Rojas is a University College student as well, and a socio-emotional coach with 10 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. So she really believes in transforming leaders to achieve transformational change in organizations, and will be able to speak a little bit from that background and perspective, especially from the legal profession as well. So brings that insight and background. Next is Terry Markle. So we'll let Terry do a wave. Terry Markle is the Associate Dean of Finance, Business Operations, and Continuing Education at University College. So Terry has been an influential leader within Fortune 500 companies, startups, and nonprofits. She's passionate about educating and mentoring future leaders, and teaches courses in our program in leadership and organizational behavior. So hopefully we're triangulating here and giving you some student perspective, working professionals, and everything in between. So at this time, we will hear from Bailey and from Maria and Terry as the evening progresses. But at this point, I would like to introduce and then turn control of the evening over to Pam Watson-Corbell, who will be doing a brief overview of emotional intelligence and giving us some foundational information to get us started. So Pam is an expert on leadership and strategy within fast-growing companies, providing executive coaching and business consulting. She is a certified trainer and coach through the Institute of Social and Emotional Intelligence, so definitely expertise in this area, and has a passion in helping people grow and change. Prior to her consulting work, she's worked in fast growth and startup businesses, including the fields of technology, home services, and professional services. So amazing group of people here tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Pam and she's going to share her screen and step us through some of the basics and foundational principles related to emotional intelligence that will then launch us into the Q&A panel portion of the evening. So Pam, thank you so much for being here, for being willing to share your expertise. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Molly. I think the first thing that I want to say is that we can all be experts at emotional intelligence. And in fact, the world would be a better place if we would all strive to do that. One of the reasons that I was drawn to emotional intelligence as a consultant was the whole factor of what makes executives successful and what does not make them successful. And Daniel Goleman did some pioneering research that was published back around 1995. So this is really fairly new information. But he found that 67% of all of the abilities that people have to move up in an organization are related to skills that revolve around emotional intelligence. So since that time, since in the last 30 years, we're seeing a lot more published about emotional intelligence. Besides his book, Emotional Intelligence, there's even emotional intelligence for dummies now. So it's really starting to get significant traction, not only in organizations work, but also just in the real world. And I do want to point out that you don't have to be employed for this to be important. So right now, in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons that we should be focused on emotional intelligence is that about a third of the workplace is comprised of millennials and Gen Z workers. At this point, my kids fall into this category, so I can relate to this wholeheartedly. First of all, while they were going through K-12 and college programs, we wanted them to have the best possible technology skills because we were turning into a technological country and dominated by technological industries, and we wanted them to have the best chances for employment. But the fact of the matter is they're now in the workplace and we're finding that their technology skills are not enough. They need to have those social and emotional skills as well. I don't know if that's the cause for mental health issues among young adults or not, but we certainly need to recognize that mental health is a big issue in our society today. And as a parent, I'll take some of the blame. I was a helicopter parent, and that didn't teach my kids resilience and problem solving. And there's a lot of other parents that are out there that are guilty of the same thing. So some of the information that's coming back from employer groups, specifically a study from the National Association of Colleges and Employers, says that workers in today's workforce do not have good skills in critical thinking, communication, or professionalism. And those are the skills that we relate to emotional intelligence. I think it's also very interesting to note that half of millennials and 75% of Gen Zers say that they have left a job voluntarily or involuntarily due to mental health issues in the last 5 years. And in grad school applications, we're also seeing some significant issues around self-awareness in particular, and I'll explain in a minute how that relates to this. And then, the big thing is that the number one reason for executive derailment in any organization is that the executives develop poor interpersonal relationships, they're rigid in their work styles, and they don't have an ability to create and motivate a team. Anybody that's ever had a job has probably had a bad boss, who knew a lot of technical information, but they didn't know about how to work with people. And that's what we're talking about. So the Goleman model is pretty simplistic. If you can break it down to 4 quadrants, and we're going to go just a little bit into this so that we're all on the same page. But basically, Goleman says that we need to have awareness and we need to be able to manage. And that actually breaks down into being aware of ourself, or having self-awareness, and having good skills in self-management. And then we need to be able to sense or be aware of what's going on in other people and use relationship management skills with those people. The model that I subscribe to is from the Institute for Social and Emotional Intelligence, and there's a few models out there. Almost everybody agrees on the 4-quadrant model. In terms of the competencies that go into the 4-quadrant model, those can vary a little bit from expert to expert. But I like the one from the Institute for Social and Emotional Awareness, which basically says it outlines these 26 competencies that you can see here. I really like to drive in and focus on self-awareness, because I think all of us go through periods of time where our self-awareness is low, and just by improving self-awareness, we can improve our overall EQ. And so self-awareness involves 3 critical competencies. The first is that you can identify what emotion you're feeling. And if you're working with somebody and they go through the fight and flight syndrome, where they just off the cuff start screaming, yelling, whatever, that's a person who cannot name their emotions. They're not mature enough to name their emotions. And just by having the ability to name your emotions, you start to develop better relationships with people. I'm sure we can all relate to that. The second competency is accurate self-assessment, and that simply means that I understand my strengths and weaknesses the same way that other people understand those. So if I think I'm a good speaker, other people think I'm a good speaker. If I think that I'm a visionary, other people think I'm a visionary. When we don't have agreement there, then that's a lack of accurate self-assessment. And the third is personal power, which can sometimes be called assertiveness, just being willing to put yourself out there and to advocate for yourself first and foremost, and then for others. Emotional intelligence, as I said, it's really infiltrating the whole world, but there's been lots of significant organizations that have adopted programs in their companies to provide training and coaching to not only executives, but frontline employees. Here's a collage of some of the logos of those companies: Microsoft, Merrill Lynch, Hilton, PepsiCo, Lockheed Martin, just all kinds of companies, all kinds of industries, nonprofits, healthcare. It's really getting significant traction. And you can just see this in the material that we teach in University College. It's like every time a textbook comes out that's been updated, there's more and more information that relates to EQ and the competencies that go with it. There's several studies that have proven that there's significant benefit to training and coaching for emotional intelligence. My favorite study was done at PepsiCo, the soft drink company. And after implementing a training and coaching program at their management level, so not frontline employees, just starting with management, they found that in a year, they had a 10% increase in productivity among employees and an 87% decrease in turnover in the company. And that the fees that they paid for the training and the coaching had 1,000% return on investment. So, there's some hard evidence that soft skills are important in an organization. And then I have one piece of good news to leave you all with. EQ can be learned. So most of us have our IQ peak sometime between the age of 25 and 30. But EQ is a lifelong learning process. And one of my favorite stories is that I coached an executive from San Diego who had retired as a colonel in the Marines and then taken a role in a publishing company. And after 6 months, the board of directors was just astounded because things were not going well. And it was because this colonel brought this colonel management style into a publishing company where things need to be creative and flow freely. And his own emotional intelligence was affecting the way that things were going in the company. And so I started coaching with him, and then he also attended a program at MIT. And as a result, he turned himself around in that job, and he ended up being one of the most favorite people that led that company. So even at 67 years old, emotional intelligence can still be learned. So now I'm going to turn it back to Molly. I think she has some questions.
And thanks so much, Pam. Hopefully that gives us all a taste of this idea of emotional intelligence and gives us some foundational knowledge about what it is, why it's important, and really why we should care. So what I wanted to do now is kind of dive into the panel Q&A portion. I did give a brief introduction, so you had a preview of who our esteemed panelists are this evening. But before we kick into the questions themselves, and I have some prepared, but we certainly welcome some in the chat. I know there have been at least a couple that have come in so far. So we'll do our best to manage our time to pop between the prepared questions and some of those that are coming through the chat as well. So thank you for submitting those as they come up for you. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to our panelists to let them give a brief introduction, and then we'll kick it off with some questions. So as a part of that, maybe as panelists are introducing themselves, and then kind of their draw to emotional intelligence and why they feel like this is an important topic. So we'll go brief introductions with that and then roll into some questions. So Bailey, if you want to get us started, I gave you a little bit of overview of Bailey, but want to give you a chance to hear from Bailey herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bailey Mayo. Like Molly introduced, I'm an executive assistant. I've been one for 10 years, and I'm finishing up my master's degree here. I'm on my last quarter, so I'll graduate in November. I'm here, so excited. And then just to draw to emotional intelligence, I found that it's really what helps me get forward in my career and what kind of holds back some people. As an executive assistant, I get to see a very different view of organizations than most other people. I spend most of my day working with executives, even though I'm fairly low down in the organization. So I get to see things that are going on and how emotional intelligence can really impact how things roll through, especially in change management.
Great. Well, we are so excited to have you, Bailey, especially as you look forward, like graduation in sight. So congratulations there. November will be upon us before we know it. Maria, let's pop over to you. If you'd like to do an introduction of yourself as well, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. I am Maria. I was a co-founder and manager of a nonprofit for over 10 years. And about 5 years ago, I became related with emotional intelligence, and I started practicing like all the knowledge I was acquiring from EQ. And I was amazed of the results that I was receiving within my organization, with the team, how everyone was collaborating better, how performance results were really thriving. So I really believe that is something that, in my experience, I learned, I am still learning, and it can make an important change.
Thank you. Excited to have you with us as well, Maria. Next, Terry, if you'd like to do an introduction and a little bit of information about your connection to EQ, and then we'll move into questions.
Thanks, Molly. Hello, everyone. I'm Terry Markle, and I am the Associate Dean for Finance, Business Operations, and Continuing Education at University College. And I've been with University College. I'm just starting my 9th year. And it's my pleasure to teach in our leadership and organizational behavior courses as well. And I've been drawn to emotional intelligence, not only from my personal experience, but it's been very rewarding for me firsthand to see the aha moments and the light bulb moments for my students when they're taking what we learn and what we talk about in the classroom into the real world, into their practical application, and really getting to see the value firsthand of that. And I'll share a couple of stories about that practical application as we go through the evening tonight.
Thank you, Terry. So excited to have you. So the first question that I wanted to pose to our panelists, so clearly we have established that emotional intelligence is a key success factor in the workplace. I think some of the information that Pam shared, especially from that PepsiCo study, there's very real tangible benefits. This is something that matters in the workplace, and by extension matters to us as employees and contributing members of any kind of organization. So thought we could kick off the panel by asking if there are some examples from our panelists. You know, Bailey, you alluded to this already a bit, so perhaps I can turn it over to you first. But just looking at how you've seen emotional intelligence, EQ, at play in your own professional experience, and what impact, either positive or negative, that it's had on you, your organization, your coworkers, and how that has played out for you. So Bailey, let's go to you first, since you started out by talking a little bit about what you see from your position and your role, to get us started with this question.
Thanks. Yeah, like I said, I work with all different levels of organizations, specifically dealing with the executives, but also how they relate to their direct reports and then those who feed up underneath them. Emotional intelligence is really the thing that I see that defines the great leaders versus just the managers. I remember I was having a really hard time once with one of my executives, and I'd worked with him for like 8 or 9 months at that point in time, and I was just struggling with him. We weren't connecting. And then the one thing is I was talking to another member in our organization. He said, you know, what he struggles with is he's super intelligent, but he has very low EQ. And I was like, that is it. That is why I am struggling with him, because he doesn't have the emotional regulation. He doesn't understand other people's emotions and how those, and he doesn't put a lot of effort into it. He doesn't mean anything malicious by it. It just doesn't process his filter, versus the other executive that I absolutely just love and adore and will follow to the end of the earth. He has extremely high EQ. And I think across all of the people that I've worked with, that is kind of the connecting factor. The ones I love to work with, the ones I adore being with and spending time with, and I'll do anything to support, they have really, really high EQ. And the ones that I don't have much lower EQ. The other thing too is when it comes to change is huge in our organizations. And if we have high EQ, we can figure out what's going on with our own emotions, and we can identify what's going on, and then how do we attack those. So when we're feeling fear, we understand that it's fear and why we're feeling the fear.
Thanks, Bailey. As you mentioned, you certainly see a variety of manifestations of EQ, and I liked that you were able to provide an example of how that impacts you as a support person in your interactions with executives, and clearly being able to see the difference and the impact that has on the work environment and culture, and even your own personal relationships and motivations. Maria, Pam, Terry, anything else that you want to add on this question?
Well, I think another very important element of EQ leaders is the way they communicate. And I had to deal with the different departments, and for a certain time, we had a director that would not communicate and would have very low levels of emotional intelligence. And this really had a toll in the organization's performance, because he was not aware of the other employees' emotions, and he wouldn't get to be able to give the message and communicate what the organization was looking for, and to get everyone to collaborate. And I've seen that managers, as Bailey said, that's the difference between managers and leaders, because managers work towards something and the leaders get everyone attuned to the same goal, and they are able to communicate and get everyone on board.
Thanks, Maria.
Do we
Pam?
have time for one more?
Sure, go for it.
I was working with a software development company, and I was training their leaders on EQ, and they really challenged me on that EQ is the primary driver behind problems in organizations. And to back that up, I pulled out a white paper by Joshua Friedman, and his studies show that about 24% of problems in organizations relate to finance and technology, and about 76% of problems in organizations relate to people. And so they said, well, we'll give you an example. Here's a software development problem that we weren't able to figure out. And so I started asking the 5 whys and just peeling back that onion about why they were having this software development issue that they thought was just purely technical. And when it came down to the center of the onion, the whole problem was that the developers weren't talking to each other, and they didn't know who was writing what code. So they kept writing over each other's code.
Great example of things that might seem disconnected to emotional intelligence, and you realize really there are threads that extend in a variety of different contexts within an organization. Great. Thank you for sharing, Pam. I mean, some of the examples that are coming up in response to this question seem to suggest that there is a relationship between EQ and really a larger organizational culture, the way of doing things, processes, procedures, standard modes of operation. So my next question is, how do you think that organizational culture impacts the lens through which organizations see and embrace, or don't, EQ? So do you think that the presence of EQ in organizations is really driven more by the organizational culture? Is it senior leadership, or is it something else altogether? So I know, Terry, we haven't heard from you yet, so maybe we'll pitch this one to you first. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, happy to jump in, Molly, on this one. There is a definite connection between EQ and organizational culture. And in the organizational behavior course that I teach, we actually have a discussion where students share examples from their real world experience in their organizations. They share examples about where situations are impacted both positively and negatively by emotional intelligence. And oftentimes the story shared would make you cringe about negative impacts of a lack of emotional intelligence. And you might wonder why it's so easy to cite experiences where a lack of emotional intelligence really has a tangible negative impact on an organization. And oftentimes these stories shared result in the individuals actually leaving the organization, or in others in their organization leaving as well. We'll talk about this a little bit more later in the discussion as well, but a commitment to emotional intelligence in an organization does take some work, and it takes commitment to put into practice. And I really believe that senior leadership of an organization can shape and set the stage for what's expected or even acceptable in the organization. And if we think about the events over the last few years, I think this has become increasingly evident. How many of us have picked up a journal or a business publication recently and heard a story or read a story about the Great Resignation or quiet quitting and the impacts that has on the organization? There's just a lot less tolerance and patience among the workforce for bad behavior or lack of emotional intelligence, either with leadership or just in general within the culture of organizations. And just this morning, I was reading an article where Dr. Simone Uhoja shares that quiet quitting is actually an opportunity to design a better workforce that's functional for all stakeholders. And she shares that today's leaders are facing increasing demands to lead with more empathy and coaching style, rather than a more traditional sort of command and control style. And more than ever, employees want to feel care and a sense of purpose, trust, and autonomy in the organization. And I think that's a really important message, that organizations that are really behind helping their leaders and their culture shift from that sort of command and control to more of a coaching and guiding and leading with empathy. I think that that's a really strong support for emotional intelligence. And I'll leave with an example of a company that I think does a really good job with this. So Google is an example of a company that prioritizes leading with empathy. And they've actually stated that leading with empathy and having emotional intelligence is the difference maker for them. And they truly feel that it's a competitive advantage for the company. And it's so important to them that they've actually developed a retention team called the Stay and Thrive team that supports infusing empathy into all levels of leadership within the company.
Oh, well, clearly dedicating resources to something that they've deemed important and seeing the return on investment. So thanks for sharing, Terry. Interesting too, even this very morning when there's information coming out about this, I think we will continue to see an increasing emphasis in industry on this important piece of what it means to be a corporate citizen and really contribute to a workplace that allows people to thrive. So maybe as a follow-up question to that, how do we think more specifically the EQ of a leader impacts the behavior of other employees? Some may even call this like the EQ of the organization. So at this point, we've been talking about it more on like an individual level, but is there such a thing as EQ of the organization as a whole related to this idea of culture? So perhaps another way of asking the question is, how do the values of leaders, especially when it comes to principles of EQ, permeate, show up in the organization? Maria, maybe we'll toss this one over to you. Do you have some thoughts to share about that?
Yes, I think what Terry was saying about the organizational culture has a lot to do with this, because it is how the organizational culture is presented within the company. They decide what values are going to permeate in the organization. So these values have to come from the top to be able to take them through all the organization. It is sometimes an organization thinks that it is behaving emotionally intelligent, but they have leaders who are not emotionally intelligent. So the values are not in sync with the goals, and they are not pursuing them accordingly. So I think it is important and I think that after the pandemic, it has become more of a necessity than before, because the way that the workspace has shifted has given us a different environment that leaders didn't have to deal with. So now the values that are needed are very different. Before, it was enough to hire someone with a high IQ, and now they are looking for people with higher EQ. And studies have also revealed that it is a stronger predictor of performance. So it is not only enough to be able to solve the solutions, to solve the problems and have the solutions, but it is important to have someone that has the relationship management, that it is one of the domains of EQ, that can navigate through the people's emotions and can guide the employees and can share those values. Because a successful leader is able to motivate the employees and also to retain the employees. And this way you can avoid the turnover. You can have higher levels of employee satisfaction, employee motivation, and everyone. And I think this is the best way to achieve wellness, and because everyone is happier at the workspace, and they have their certainty that they are following certain specific values from the organization. But besides being in the mission and the vision and all the organization information, the leaders and especially it has to come from the seniorship, because it has to go down to permeate all the organizations so that all those values can be followed authentically.
Thanks, Maria. I know, Bailey, if you want to chime in at all, I know you have exposure to a variety of executives and kind of the many subcultures within their project teams and so forth. Do you have any thoughts based on your experience about how you've seen the leaders' emotional intelligence playing out in terms of the organization as a whole, or even in many sub-teams? Be curious if you have some insights to share about that.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to bring up 2 points that I was just going to jump in anyway off of what Maria said. And one, she said people with higher EQ generally have safer jobs. I was in preparation for this panel actually kind of reading through Daniel Goleman's book, and in his recent forward attachment to it, he actually talked about AI coming up now and how AI is not able to actually do emotions in the messages and stuff like that. And so what he said is that people in jobs that involve higher levels of EQ are actually generally safer and have better job security as we move through and have more AI into our work roles. So I think that's a huge thing, especially since a lot of us are, concerned, oh, my job can be taken over by a machine. Not necessarily if it involves a lot of high EQ factors. The other thing too is, I think for me, and it's actually something I wrote my capstone on, is we use the word leadership a little interchangeably with management. But what I've learned throughout the degree too is leadership can talk about anybody. You don't necessarily need to have authority to be a leader. And so when we talk about leaders, it can be anybody at any level of a company. And so when you come in and you're interviewing and you show high EQ, we can train competencies on this is how you use Microsoft Word, or this is how you use this tool. EQ is much higher. Like Pam said, we can train it, but we're going to want to hire somebody who has a higher level of emotional intelligence. They're more likely to get hired, and then they're more likely to stay in that job and be a leader, even though they're not formally notified or formally seen in the organization as a leader.
Interesting points. Yeah, the idea of artificial intelligence and what it can do and what those limitations are, and really the human factor and how we interact with others and inspire greatness and encourage others to thrive, arguably is something that's much more difficult to achieve through AI than real live human beings. So true. So maybe transitioning a little bit. So regardless the industries in which we work, I think it's probably fair to say that all of us on the panel, and all of our participants here tonight as well, have really experienced a tremendous amount of change post-COVID and our changing workforce. So I'm curious how EQ influences our ability to manage change and navigate uncertainty. So we've talked a little bit about that already. But wondering if we have some examples in mind of how emotional intelligence helps us in terms of our shift to a largely remote workplace, or to the increasing demands that we're seeing in the workplace. So I'm thinking things like web-based and virtual communication, influence of social media, a lot of these changes in the workplace that are relatively new. How does emotional intelligence equip us to really manage those successfully? In light of, some would argue, unprecedented change?
I can take that. I think in my experience working with groups while they've been implementing a new change, what's important is to get them to articulate what they're feeling about the change. So it goes back to that very basic competency that I talked about earlier, emotional awareness. The ability to name your emotions allows you to start dealing with it logically instead of with the other side of your brain. And when you start dealing with it logically, then it becomes less threatening to you. So as a change management consultant, one of the things that we need to do is create an environment where people feel free to come forward. And I would say to anybody in the group that's a leader or a manager, the more you create that environment where people feel like they can say what needs to be said, the closer you're getting to a true environment of emotional freedom and awareness, and you'll be able to deal with the positives and the negatives.
Well, change is never easy, but leveraging these concepts of self-awareness and emotional intelligence can certainly help us navigate that in more successful ways. Any other thoughts from panelists on that question around the role of EQ in navigating change?
I can chime in. Another important competency about EQ is adaptability, which I think is one of the most important competencies to be able to acknowledge change. And I've seen this not only in, as Bailey was saying, everyone can be a leader. Everyone can be a leader in their family, with their friends, as a mother, as a friend. And the people that are able to be flexible and adapt are people that are prepared for everything. And when they try to hold on to the status quo, they cannot evolve, they cannot grow, they cannot, manager cannot be able to see through the changes that are needed and to understand what the company needs. So, and you need to have self-awareness to be able to adapt. That was what Pam was saying. You need to be able to acknowledge like the emotions and everything that's going on, to be able to know that change is coming and to be able to see the opportunities or the threats in their case that you can anticipate and tackle them before they come along.
Thanks, Maria. I think related in that same vein a little bit, we've talked a bit about emotional intelligence at the individual level, at the organizational level, but wanted to ask a little bit more deeply about this idea between the relationship of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Clearly, Pam talked us through that there is a relationship. That's one of the components. But where does one even start in terms of better understanding EQ if that positions us to be adaptable and open to change and more successful? So maybe Terry, I'll ask you if you want to address this one. But where do we even begin in terms of this process of further exploration?
Sure. And as you mentioned, Pam alluded to the fact that self-awareness, and I would even add self-management, are really the critical foundations for understanding and developing emotional intelligence. And I love this statement. I use this in my class a lot, and it's from an organizational psychologist and researcher, Tasha Eurich, and she is from the Institute for Social and Emotional Intelligence. And she notes that in studying thousands of people from all around the world, 95% of people believe that they're self-aware, but in actuality, only about 10 to 15% really are. And I think this is a really strong data point to support the opportunity for growth that many of us have in this area. And I'd love to share a story that is as a student story. So this is a real life example from my class a couple of quarters ago. And I had a student, we cover a lot of emotional intelligence and specifically around self-awareness and self-management in the beginning of the course. And I had a student approach me and say, you know, I'm learning so much, and this is really resonating with me, and I'm getting ready to go in. I've been with this organization for a number of years. I'm getting ready to go in for my performance management and my career conversation. And it's really important for me. I'm feeling really, you know, like I'm not getting the support I need from my company. I feel like I'm stuck. And I'm wondering if you would, she was asking me to take a look at her notes and sort of the answers to questions that she was planning to share in this session. And I, of course, said absolutely. And it became very clear to me when I was looking at her approach, she was translating what was going on for her frustration with the organization into all of her responses. So in other words, she hadn't really made the connection to layer on the self-awareness or the self-management piece around those emotions. And it was getting in the way of her being able to advance in her career. So we talked through a number of approaches where she could actually kind of use those self-awareness and self-management skills to sort of adapt and change her responses. And the end result is that she reached out to me after her conversation and was just overwhelmed. She said, this is the best career conversation I've ever had. this approach was so well received by my leadership. I'm being given opportunities now for career growth and career advancement. And, she definitely was a firm believer in the connection to kind of what she was learning in the class about emotional intelligence, and how on a very individual level, so not even as a leader, but as an individual level, how that was really going to help advance and support her career going forward. So I think that the takeaway is that in organizations where emotional intelligence is part of the culture and individuals are motivated to have growth around self-awareness, that it can really result in a lot of tangible benefits, like higher employee satisfaction, higher employee engagement, career opportunities, which is what we just shared, and also an employee retention, which is a huge issue right now for many companies and leaders of those companies. So just thought I would share that story with you all on impact, real impact on an individual level with emotional intelligence.
Well, to your point, Terry, it sounds like for this particular student, there was a great opportunity to perhaps shift perspective a bit and see things through a slightly different lens that demonstrated to an employer there is a degree of self-awareness here in the way that I craft my interactions that really poised her for success in a way that a slightly less aware and maybe less emotionally intelligent approach would have landed her. So always exciting and inspiring when you hear real life examples of people who have put some of these ideas around self-awareness and emotional intelligence into practice and seen some kind of tangible difference in the outcome. So I appreciate you sharing that story. I guess maybe related to that, if, and this is open to any of the panelists, but Terry, I don't know, since you just shared that story in particular, if you were to make a suggestion or two to our audience members, fellow panelists, about how to increase the EQ. We've been talking all night about how it's important, how it has tangible benefits for the organization, the individual, your own career pathing. But where might we start? So how can we grow our EQ regardless of our job, our experience, our status as a student, a professional, wherever we are in our career stage? And so as we move forward to thinking about the now what, some tangible takeaways for our audience members in terms of what some next steps might be for people who are interested in further pursuing this and doing some of their own work and improving.
Absolutely. I would say that the first step, you can start really simple, is to educate yourself and really seek out resources to learn more about emotional intelligence. And as we've mentioned several on this session, but there are courses on LinkedIn Learning if you have access to that. And there's also great information and some free EQ assessments that you can find at the 6 second, so 6, the number 6 second.org website. And also it's a great resource for learning a little bit more about emotional intelligence as well. So I think taking that step to educate yourself a bit more, and then a really important factor in all of this, and this came up in the chat in one of the questions as well, so I can kind of address that, is to be open to feedback, and not just be open to feedback, but seek out feedback from others. So feedback from colleagues, from supervisors, perhaps from a mentor, and really seek out specific feedback related to those competencies that Pam shared around specifically self-awareness and self-management might be a good place to start. And if you are interested in receiving feedback, I think this was the question that came up in the chat, how can you get authentic feedback without making it feel like you're putting the individual on the spot? Is there are some tools. There's one in particular called a 360 tool that you can look into and gain a little more insight on, where the feedback is actually anonymous. So you can really seek out specific feedback in an area related to that does not put the individual giving the feedback on the spot. The other way to do that is to work with a mentor where there's not that supervisor or colleague relationship, where the mentor is a little bit more objective and can give you specific feedback and ideas around that as well. So those are just a couple of suggestions. I bet that the panel has a few more to add as well.
Maybe we can pop over to you, Pam. You've done so much consulting work and have worked with so many executives and people at different levels in their career. What would you have to add in terms of next steps for anybody who might be interested in improving their own emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I always encourage the people that I'm coaching to keep a journal. And one of the things I like them to do is journal at night about your day. I call it your daily examen. And you can Google that, EXAMAN. There's lots of different tools. But I ask them to just go through their day, like go through every 3-hour period and say, what emotion was I feeling during this period? And after a few days of journaling about what emotions you're noticing in yourself each day, then you will start to see where you want to be and where you don't want to be. And I'll be honest, when I started doing that, I was shocked at all the negative emotions that I had. And I said, I don't want to live my life like this. And I started making conscious changes so that when I wrote in my journal at night, I'd have positive things to write down.
I know Bailey, Maria, have either of you, knowing that you are student representatives on the panel and have clearly engaged in some formal academic inquiry around this topic, but what are some of the things that have led you to a greater sense of self-awareness, either in your role as a student or as a professional, that you might have to share with our audience as well?
I think for me, it's starting with yourself. You can't help others unless you know how to fix yourself. And I remember in what group facilitation, Pam, I can't remember the name of the class that you taught for us, but we spent a little bit of time talking about there's an emotional wheel that Pam presented to us, and that's helped a lot. And what it does is it breaks down emotion, and it can kind of drive you down into what specifically you're feeling. So there's not just anger, but there's like 8 or 10 things inside anger and then things inside of that. So it really helps you kind of drive down into what you're really feeling. And then once you figure that out, then you can move further from there. And then once you understand, you can start help other people break it down. Going back to the feedback question, one thing that I just listened to on a podcast recently was getting yourself a challenge group. It's a group that's willing to challenge you and give you critical feedback, and that you know you can always run things by, and that they'll pick it apart, not because to be mean, but with their best intention to help you grow. And so trying to figure out who your challenge group is so you can find out, hey, how did I actually react to that? You know, I thought I came off this way, but did I come off a different way?
The tool that Bailey referred to is the Junto, Junto emotion wheel. And it's also available. If you just Google it, you can download a copy of it.
Thanks, Pam. Some really great resources that we're sharing here. So hopefully that at least gets you started on a journey as you step forward towards a greater degree of self-awareness and hopefully improving your own emotional intelligence and all the benefits that come with that. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I know we have just a couple of minutes left. I do think we addressed many of the questions that were coming in through the chat and other channels, but wanted to pause and see if there were any final questions from participants as we move towards kind of wrapping things up here. Pause for just a moment to see if there are any lingering questions that may have been prompted by the most recent responses from our panelists.
I have a question. When we talk about like values, like the managers having to, display, great values that translate to the organization culture. But I feel like when we talk about managers or leaders, that just a few people at the top, but then you have an entire team or entire employees. And that is there something, or can we also start looking at how peers or as employees can influence each other or like those with best values or like best IQ can be used to, influence their team or their peers, because I feel like the pressure is always at the top, and just a few people to be able to influence this majority of people, it may take a long time. But I feel like if we also start noticing employees or peers that have something good to share or have good values or good things that the organization can learn from in terms of EQ, I think it's an area maybe studies can be conducted also to see how can that, progress the entire EQ phenomenon within an organization.
I read a really interesting concept in the book called Scaling Up by Vern Harnish. And he has a regular regimen where every Monday morning you catch people doing good things. And he asked every employee in the organization, there we go, Molly's got it.
I have it right here in front of me. Like, speaking of, Pam, we didn't even plan that.
He asked every employee in the organization to nominate people who were doing the right thing last week. And then they give out kudos to employees for being, positive.
I love that, Pam. Of course, I have the book here ready at hand, so a big fan of that too. So thanks so much for the question, Ms. Brown. I do want to be mindful of time. I know there may be some additional great questions out there. In the interest of time, I would like to formally wrap us up. I know that the participants who have additional questions, our panelists have agreed to stick around a little bit longer. If some of you have burning questions that you can't live without asking our panelists. But do want to formally close by just extending my deep gratitude again for all of our participants tonight. As I mentioned before, you could have been a lot of different places this evening. Really honored that you took the time to spend with us discussing this very interesting, important, timely, relevant topic. A heartfelt thank you to Pam, Bailey, Maria, Terry. You ladies are amazing. Really appreciate your guidance, advice, wisdom, insight, tips, all of the above. Thank you to Brian for helping coordinate this, set it up, and be our chat manager. You too, Amanda. Really a team effort in terms of getting this off the ground and making it such a great experience. So thank you to all of you again. Thrilled that you joined us. This will formally conclude the town hall. But if you have additional questions or would like to stick around for a little bit, we can certainly leave the Zoom room open and entertain a few additional questions. Otherwise, please go forth, have a delightful rest of your evening, and thank you again for your time. Good night, everybody.